weekend wrap up from the Pentagon. This week was an unusual week because the 4th of July was on a Thursday. Now, Tom, you and I were talking before we going. Pentagon reporter Tom joining us. You and I were talking before we got going. This was kind of a weird week because of the 4th. Still tons of information out there. A lot of it in Europe. This was kind of a weird week compared to some other weeks because of this.
A lot of the attention was focused on Europe, even though it was our July 4th holiday. A lot of elections and roundup elections happening or will happen soon. And they have a big impact on what the Pentagon has to do, particularly on NATO and Ukraine. British election was yesterday, July 4th, and landslide.
They do that on purpose, Tom?
No, I think that was just an oversight by, that shows how not thinking the Conservative Party was by scheduling elections on July 4th. But the Labour Party ousted the Conservative Party after 14 years in power. The latest count was about 410 seats for Labour to 131 for Conservatives in the 650-member House of Commons. And for those who are not clear how it works, whatever party has the majority in the House of Commons is asked by the Queen, or now I guess the King, to form a government, and then that leader of the party is usually the Prime Minister. So you have the head of the Labour Party now will be the next Prime Minister. Interesting, other parts of the election there, Chuck, is that the Nigel Farage, the real right-winger and a big sort of Trump ally, he got a seat in Parliament after 7 failed attempts. So he'll be in Parliament. He's in his own party. He's not a Labour or Liberal Democrat or Conservative. They have 3 parties there. Liz Truss, who had been the Prime Minister of England a real short period of time, she's out. She lost her seat. So did Grant Shapps. He's the defense minister, or was the defense minister for the United Kingdom. So I was wondering, well, who's going to be here for the United Kingdom next week during this big NATO summit here in Washington, D.C.? So that's the English one. You want to pause on that, or should I continue?
Which I know happened a week or so ago. Because I'm sort of interested in European politics a little bit more. So a lot of it has to do with Ukraine. And ultimately, I want to lead up to a question of, I wonder how much Ukraine has to do, if anything, with these elections.
Yeah. Well, there's two other elections going on this weekend. Today in Iran, it's a runoff between 2 candidates to be president of Iran. You may remember that the former president died in a helicopter crash.
There was an opening.
Yeah. And you have a reformist and an ultra-conservative. And the reformist said he would engage the West in nuclear talks and, to lift the sanctions. The other one, the hardliner, said he's going to defeat sanctions and strengthen economic ties with other countries. But, really, Jack, it doesn't matter who wins necessarily, because all the politics there are decided by the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei.
When you have someone who says we're going to engage talks with the West, right? Do they ever find themselves at odds with the Ayatollah, or is it one of those deals where they even know, look, we don't really get at odds with the Ayatollah?
No, it's a good question, because in the past, and I'm sorry I can't think of the name of the former president, one of them did try to engage in the West, and he made some progress. But ultimately, what happens is, any kind of big progress, perhaps, is blocked by the Ayatollah, who doesn't want to really deal with the West, because we're all on the bad side on the street, according to him. It's helpful in the sense that you could have a moderating voice within the Iranian hierarchy. Who controls what in Iran is a mystery to me. Who controls which police force, which military? There's the Republican National Guard, which is more a religious one. Those are the ones that support Hamas and Hezbollah for the most part. You have the Iranian military. So, it's not as clear-cut who controls what ultimately.
So let's move to France, because we talked a little bit about England. England kind of went more left of center. Now, is there left? Can we use like an American version of this on it? More social programs, not as conservative, not as what's the word? Real patriotic, nationalist. Is European nations, would it be similar to the right and left here?
Not really, and yes, both. But the Labour Party has been out of power for so long that it's difficult to define what they're going to do. One of the criticisms of the new Prime Minister, the Labour leader, from his own party members, is that he's too moderate. And so in the Labour Party in England, the United Kingdom, excuse me, you have moderate, what we would consider moderate Democrats here in the United States. Democrats like, Tim Kaine from Virginia, okay, or
Joe
John,
Manchin when he was at West Virginia, and
yeah,
before.
or John Tester from Montana, for example. Moderate Democrats, and then they also have the range where they have more what you and I would consider old style liberal Democrats in there. Like more like a Chuck Schumer liberal, not a far lefty liberal. And there are some far lefties, like more like Elizabeth Warren. So the scope of the Democratic Party here is moderates, sort of more to the left, and then more and more to the left. And that's what the Labour Party generally is. So you could now the question is, you mentioned earlier in the show here, what's the impact of all these elections on Ukraine? Well, let's go back to what happened in Italy earlier, where the far right candidate she's now the new prime minister, yet she's very strongly in support of Ukraine, very strong support of NATO. So it's dangerous to assume on a right-left political dichotomy whether Ukraine support for NATO will fade or strengthen. I'm going to guess that the Labour Party, even though I don't know who their defense minister is going to be unless they've announced it today and I missed it, I'm going to guess that the Labour Party is going to continue strong support of Ukraine, strong support of the decimated UK military, and strong support of NATO. I don't really think that that's a concern. I haven't heard any of those concerns at the Pentagon. Now, France might be a different story.
Me, I have very strong feelings about the French time. There's no need to rehash those. I've been very vocal in the past. But
have you ever been to France?
No,
okay.
Hell no. I'm not going either place unless it's
I know you don't like Canada. I know that. That's
enough to make it in France, and they're not tough. But anyway, all right. So the elections in France with Macron. What do we know about the new? Do we call them presidents? What do we call them in France?
Well, let's just be clear here. Macron, who is the president of France, is not up for re-election, nor is there a direct political impact on him in the sense that he's going to lose office. These are elections like they were in the UK for the National Assembly in France, and they'll have a prime minister. So they have a prime minister and a president in France. Okay,
who's more powerful?
The president generally is more powerful because he or she controls foreign policy and the military and sort of macro, no pun intended on his name, macroeconomic policy. The prime minister is powerful in domestic issues and other areas. Okay, so
I misunderstood that. I thought Macron was out.
No, he's not. Now, the first round of elections was held, and they're having their runoffs on Sunday. And in that first round, the far right party, now this is a distinction from what we just said in Britain, really had the most, but didn't have an outright majority for the parliament. The French system, not surprisingly, Chuck, is a little less straightforward than the British system. So in other words, in the first round, candidates are running for all these seats in the legislature. I don't have the number in my head how many seats there are. But say you and I are running for one district and you win and get more than 50% of the vote, you don't have to, you've gotten that seat. You don't stand for the runoff. You don't have to do a runoff on Sunday. So the runoff is only for the seats where there wasn't an absolute majority by one candidate. That's why guessing what the outcome is going to be is difficult. Here's why. There's another reason why. So in these seats where there's been no 50% winner, if you have the far right candidate, which you do, and then you have two other candidates, moderates, they're making deals. So one's going to drop out of the race and support the other one to try to deny that seat to the far right candidate. Am I making
it? Yeah, no, I see what you're saying there. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the idea is that they could prevent the Le Pen, her party is the far right party, Le Pen's party from getting an absolute majority in the National Assembly. Because then, just like in Britain, whichever party has the majority in the National Assembly chooses the prime minister. So one time before in France, this has happened where the president and the prime minister were different parties, certainly different parties and different ideologies. I had this in my head, but I remember that the prime minister was actually a socialist. So it was the far left then, as opposed to the far right. And it worked. It wasn't horrible for France then, but this is a whole different dynamic. Now, on your question about NATO and Ukraine, as I said, that's not as clear what will happen with NATO and Ukraine if if the National Assembly in France is, or the prime minister is, a far right person. The prime minister probably would be Le Pen. She would probably be chosen. Again, they have to have an absolute majority in the National Assembly, and that's not certain yet.
About Ukraine, because obviously, and you and I have talked about this on my radio show a lot, but it bears repeating. The closer you are to Russia, the more concerned you are. Not that we're not concerned in the United States, but like the Balkans, for example, they're really concerned about this, right? The closer you are to Russia, you're really concerned about this war in Ukraine. But we've learned over this week that global confidence in Vladimir Zelensky has dropped. And
Yeah.
when this thing first kicked off, he would come here, he'd wear like his military looking outfit. He didn't leave Ukraine. He stayed there with his wife and family, all the pictures. He was the world's favorite person on the cover of Time magazine, all of that. And you and I started asking you these questions when you and I very first started doing my radio show. I was like, how long does this last? I feel like I was early on with this. This was still back the Ghost of Kiev days when I would think this in my head. It's like, how long does this last? Are we starting to see now just people are getting tired of sending weapons? I mean, what do you think this is? Has anything big happened for people to think this?
No, nothing big has happened. What has happened is it's now gone on and on and on, and you're settling into the reality of this war and the reality of the frustrations of Zelensky and others in Ukraine. Its leadership, its civilians, its support from allies. That no movement is happening in significant ways that suggest an end to the war, especially on favorable terms to Ukraine. That's unfortunate for a lot of reasons. One, I'm a strong skeptic of the Pentagon and the Biden administration's approach to supplying weapons to Ukraine. You're either all in or all out. I get the understanding that at the beginning of the war, they needed certain things, and it made no sense to supply them with long-range missiles, for example. They needed certain defenses, and it worked. And so a measured approach to supplying weapons that they can use and use them well makes sense. That being said, there's a strong argument that weapons soon, and I'm not even talking about F-16s. Everyone talks about F-16s. That, to me, that's nice, but those are not the weapons that are going to stop Russia on the ground or pulverize Russian, landing strips where they're taking off and bombing the infrastructure of Ukraine. They needed to go all in. I think Europe, as you said, is recognizing this fact. What you were talking about was a Pew Research survey that was released this week of 36 countries around the world, North and South America, Europe, Asia, Middle East, and Africa, showing that an average of 46% of those surveyed do not have confidence in Zelensky, compared to 40% who said they do. And that's a lot lower than it was, a year ago and certainly 2 years ago. And a lot of that is war fatigue. Unfortunately, with these kind of surveys, you don't quite know who was, where that number is coming from. They did break it down by countries. And the most dramatic decline in opinion towards Zelensky is in Poland, and that reflects the tensions between Poland and Ukraine over the grain shipments and the fact that Poland has up to 2 million Ukrainian refugees, and people want to know what's going to happen. So, there are dynamics like that. But let's look at the reality. It is in some senses a stalemate. What really amazes me, Chuck, among the things in the Ukraine-Russian conflict is you have such stalemate and so much, and then you have these brilliant moves by Ukraine. Once again, Russia had to pull out some ships from the Black Sea. Ukraine, which has no navy, has made the Black Sea almost totally inhospitable for Russian vessels, because of their craftiness and their creativity, and now with longer-range U.S. and British supplied missiles, that helps too. So, you see where Ukraine does things so very well. Excuse me. They're suffering from a lack of manpower now. They have conscription, which is not popular in Ukraine, nor is it popular in Russia. But, they're running out of people. They're running out of bodies. And the civilians are taking a toll because their infrastructure is crushed. So, it's tough to look at Zelensky and you want to blame someone, and they're blaming him, as other nation leaders are. I don't think there's less support in NATO at all for Zelensky. I don't think there's any measurable less support, and I think we'll see as much as possible next week here at the summit, the NATO summit in Washington, and a show of support from Zelensky. I'm sure he's going to show up.
Of course he is. I would imagine he would show up too. Seems like a good idea for him to show up. All right, last thing, Tom. Really, really big report. This is very interesting. Not surprising, like you put in the notes, but interesting. The CIA assessment that was circulated amongst U.S. officials this week about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And remind us all, I don't know, 6 months ago, the Supreme Court in Israel, or whatever the court system there is, still said, hey, look, Benjamin Netanyahu can still be tried. He's on some charges there for they're not conspiracy charges. Were they fraud charges?
They're corruption charges.
Corruption charges there in Israel. But this CIA, this assessment that's going around, thinking that he thinks he can kind of do whatever. What do we know about this?
The CIA has assessed that Netanyahu wants to maintain support from his people and his far right wing of his coalition by discussing the future of Gaza in the vaguest terms possible. This was first reported by CNN. But CIA says how he's defying pressure from the Biden administration, as well as folks in his own government. Remember, Benny Gantz left over this. And because they want him to define what the end state of Gaza is going to be like. I'm stepping it back from what it's difficult to even read what he wants. Right now, the West Bank is on fire as more land grabs are going on by the Israelis. If you're talking about a two-state solution, we're talking about the West Bank, which is occupied territory, and Gaza. So according to this assessment, the benchmarks include completing what Netanyahu calls major military operations, whatever that is, as well as eliminating the Hamas military commander, Mohammed Daif. Those are pretty big goals to do, and major military operations is vague enough that you could be flexible in how you define that. Bottom line here is the CIA thinks that Netanyahu is going to string out the war as long as possible, basically for his own political survival.
I just listened to the program. I've been saying that. Right. It feels like we could have saved some money.
Hey, before we go, I want to add two quick, I know we're on time, but I got two quick things. I like to find things that are not necessarily headlines, but this is important. This is going to have an impact on us, the United States, and others. So this week, Russia has now its first armed combat icebreaker. Okay, armed combat icebreaker. It's heading for open water sea trials or factory trials, whatever you call it. So, Russia has commissioned 3 new nuclear icebreakers over the last 4 years. 3 more are under construction. This is as the Arctic melts, right? And so this is an armed icebreaker with, AK-17 machine guns, launch anti-ship missiles, and cruise missiles on this icebreaker. So you sink on that.
What are they going to, you feel like they're going to use it obviously somewhere cold, right? The icebreaker.
Well, they're trying to take control of the Arctic. They're trying to, as the Arctic ice melts, there's a scramble about who's going to control it. The United States, there was a treaty that Russia, Soviet Union / Russia ignores basically of the Arctic nations. In other words, every nation that is in the Arctic Circle, which includes the United States because of Alaska. Okay, so they want to, this icy waters through the Northern Sea route, they'll use these combat ships to escort their vessels through there should anyone try to stop them. Now, it's capable of breaking through about 5.5 feet of ice, which is pretty good. That's most of the Arctic Ocean. And, meanwhile, China, which was not on the Arctic Circle, Chuck, they have a new icebreaker that entered service this week. They now have 3 with a 4th one under construction. This is not military icebreaker, but still, we are so far behind on the icebreaker. I've been writing this story about icebreakers for at least 10 years.
And so the value of them is you can go places that are usually frozen. You can't get on, right?
That's right.
And you can get other shit. What do we think's up there in the Arctic besides polar bears? Are we thinking there's oil there? There's got to be something there.
A lot of minerals up there. A lot of minerals. And second, the sea route, the elusive, passage to India sea route that all the explorers from Europe were trying to find, it would finally happen, and that would cut shipping routes and times and costs dramatically. It would mean you wouldn't have to build another canal through Central America because it's too small for bigger ships. A lot of stuff. So there's the whole practical side. And who controls it? Right now it's sort of open territory, kind of governed by the nations, Canada, the United States, Russia, Sweden, and the other nations at Iceland. I'm not going to, show off my geographic skills, but all those nations that are in the Arctic Circle. But China has declared itself a near Arctic nation. So
it's all part of one China,
right? So it's part of it. So they want to reap a lot of minerals, some oil probably, and the danger is, of course, that the polar bears, which you joked about, they're probably going to die because the ice is melting and they're losing their habitat. And I know you don't necessarily care about that, but I do. That was real. That was a shot. I was just giving you a little they're nice animals.
Exactly, and nothing like a polar fur for the missus.
There you go.
I'm just kidding, Tom. Calm down. That's a joke.
I know. I'm willing to wait for your callers to get on you on that one.
Stuff. Expect next week to be a lot of fun too. Hope you have a phenomenal weekend, my friend. Hope you had a good. I imagine Washington does the 4th up real big.
A lot of fireworks here. I went to a baseball game, as I mentioned to you earlier, off air, and it was always fun to go to a baseball game, and especially on the July 4th. And the sad thing was because of just everything, the monuments, the memorials were closed. You couldn't go to the memorials, which I kind of think it's unfortunate on July 4th. I mean, I understand there's a terrorist threat, and I'm not being critical. I want to be clear. I'm not being critical of the decision. I'm just lamenting the fact that, I was on my Vespa and I was, eager to just kind of go see Tom and Abe and all the guys. And it was just, not able to do it. And it's unfortunate. But, Washington, great. When I moved here, I lived about 6 blocks. I lived along the Potomac River, about 6 blocks south of the National Mall where the monuments are and the Smithsonian Museums. And I was used to walk every July 4th up. The Beach Boys would play in the afternoon, and you sat in the sun all day. Then you hear the wonderful, beautiful National Symphony play on the Capitol, on the west side of the Capitol, and an amazing fireworks display every year. Never got old. I've been here many years now. Never gets old.
Here that happened in Jackson, Tennessee. I can assure you of that. Although we did have a freedom fireworks celebration that was very well attended.
What? This is our nation's capital, and it should be like that. I mean, I lived for a long time in a part of Washington, D.C. called the Palisades. And every July 4th, they have a parade with the Cub Scouts and all the floats from the kids in the schools and the gay marching band and all the politicians come and throw candy. It's about a small town parade in all the great ways possible here in Washington, D.C. So, I have that, and then I have the big, national stuff. It's really lucky.
It's a cool place to be. Tom Squieteri. We'll do it again next week, my friend.